we go. So the recording is now started. We will start with Unit 8, the post-war period and the Cold War. So this will take us from 1945 to about 1980 or so. So we're going from the end of World War II to all the way to Reagan's presidency for this sort of unit. So we start off with President Truman. So if you remember, Truman took over after FDR croaked and sort of died. So Truman takes office after that. Truman is formally elected in the election of 1946, and he takes his presidency from that mark. So we get the beginning of the Cold War. Moscow, what is the Cold War? You know.
It was a war, but there was no fighting involved.
Yeah, so it's a war of really economics and politics more than is a war of guns and bullets. That's a country. Good job. So what comes out of the Cold War is sort of proxy wars. So proxy wars will be fought in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, places such like that. Mike, what's your question? So Truman's foreign policy initiatives, let's go over that. So a big trademark of Truman's presidency will be called the Truman Doctrine. So we'll get into that specifics, but as of right now, the Soviets first refused to recognize the government in exile of Poland. So as you know, World War II, Poland capitulates to the Nazis and the Soviets also. The Soviets drive through the country all the way to Berlin, and the Western Polish government that was in Britain, sort of being friendly there, tried to go back to Poland, and the Soviets said, "I don't know who you are, go away." So this is sort of the start of the Iron Curtain. So what will happen is the Soviets will install governments in places like Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary. So we get Tito in Yugoslavia. We get other things in other countries. But just know that the descent of the Iron Curtain really starts with the Soviet refusal to welcome back the Polish sort of exilees and sort of Polish political leaders. So Truman's doctrine, there's some buzzwords you should know. One of the words is containment. So containment means stopping the spread of communism. So what we get out of the Cold War is an ideological battle. So we get capitalism versus communism. So Truman's sort of goal is to restrict and to contain communism as much as he can. So that means preventing it from going into other countries through economic means. So Greece and Turkey, countries who are especially poor after World War II, they are kind of vulnerable to the Soviet expansion of their economics. So the US and the Allies, Britain and France, invest large sums into those countries, Greece and Turkey especially, and those get sort of propped up as Western allies. So a big thing to know about the Truman Doctrine is that it's achieved through economic means. So aiding and allying countries through economic means. If you remember, it's a lot like South America, right? In order to get people on our side, Teddy Roosevelt invested in a lot of Latin American countries and gave them a lot of money, factories, such things like that. So the long telegram, this is sort of just the sort of like event name you could use for containment. It's just saying that the U.S. would not go to war with the Soviets, but if the Soviets went to war with the U.S. ally, the U.S. would go to war with the Soviet Union. So this is preventing the spread of communism and encouraging the Soviets to abandon their sort of aggressive policies. So the aggressive policies of the Soviets were moving into the Eastern nations of Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Belarus, those types of things. So the Marshall Plan. So basically Europe after World War II, it kind of looks like this photo. So if you see in the top right-hand corner, I have Dresden, 1945. So Dresden becomes one of those cities that's just utterly bombed. It's bombed to hell by both the Nazis and the Allied camps. So these sort of cities are absolutely ruined. In order to revive these cities, they need a lot of money. So the United States, in sort of stepping on the world pedestal and becoming a arsenal of democracy is the key word if you want to do it like that, they give $12 million to European aid. They offer this aid to all members of Europe, regardless of their sort of alignment. So they offered this aid to the communist countries as well, but all of the communist countries under the direction of Joseph Stalin deny this money. So all this aid is going to the Western countries of West Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. All these countries are given economic aid by the West. So this is our precursor to the European Union. So these sort of trade relations and these sort of economic aid stimulus connects the continent of Europe, or especially the Western continent, and that will lead us into the European Union that is soon to come. Well, not soon to come, I guess, really just 50 years to come. So we also get the formation of NATO after the war. So we get NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a defensive treaty. So it's a defensive alliance. This means that if any NATO country is attacked by another country, all the NATO allies will come to defend that country. It is not an aggressive pact. So if one of the NATO countries declares war on another country, that doesn't mean all of the NATO members go to war with that country, even though it's probably likely to happen because of their army relations and such things like that. But just know it's a defensive treaty. Truman had a very, very difficult time trying to convince Congress and especially the Senate that it was necessary to join NATO because the US was still kind of in their era of let's stay out of foreign policy. After the formation of NATO, this is the switch from abstaining from foreign policy to becoming the figurehead of it around the world. So becoming the world leader and becoming the superpower really occurs in 1949 after World War II. So if you remember Washington's farewell address, right, this is sort of our flip. So we go from staying out of Europe to becoming the leader of Europe and leader of the world, basically. So let me just explain the map first. So the blue here is our West Germany. That is our NATO country. That is our allies country. Germany is split into three parts. So the top part up here, this is Britain. The middle part is France. And the bottom part is the United States. Honestly, I could be wrong. It really doesn't matter. Just know it's divided into three parts. Berlin's the same way. So Berlin is divided in two. The Soviets control the east, and the Allies control the west of Berlin. So this is Berlin right here. This green is Berlin. What becomes an issue, and what leads us to the crisis of Berlin, is Soviets saying that we're not going to allow you to drive your trucks through our country anymore. So if you see, Berlin is surrounded by Soviet territory, and the Soviets say, no American trucks will go into Berlin from now on. So the US does the Berlin airlift. So to get around the Soviet blockade, they will airlift a bunch of supplies. I think it's about like a couple $100 million worth of supplies to Western Berlin. So it's also like a big sort of dividing consumerism. So West Berlin will flourish. A lot of people from East Berlin will go to West Berlin, and East Berlin will be very poor, impoverished, very destroyed. So if you want to do a compare and contrast the Soviet Union versus capitalism versus communism for this era, you could do West Berlin versus East Berlin. The Soviets eventually have to stop immigration from the East to the West just because the amount of people who are leaving Soviet country to go to the West. Yeah.
That was in Berlin, and so basically the East was not allowing the U.S. to like put trade supplies.
Yeah, so if you see, this is sort of surrounded by red.
Yeah.
So what would happen is trucks from the West would go in there to bring supplies to the West controlled Berlin, and they would go out. The Soviets said, we don't want your trucks coming through anymore. So in order to give supply to their half of the city, they had to fly in the supplies. Yeah, so the Berlin airlift eventually ends when the Soviets allow supply to go into West Berlin. So the National Security Council also gets formed out of this. The National Security Council is just basically a group of foreign affair advisors who work for the president. So these people are sort of like a foreign affairs cabinet. So this National Security Council will aid the president in foreign wars, foreign sort of ambitions and those sort of things. So they also create the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, as it was called. The purpose of the CIA is to counter the KGB, and it is a spy network of the US. So spy warfare will also begin after the second, well, it will not begin, but it will really become just between the KGB and the CIA after World War II. Issues in Asia. So there are also issues in Asia besides just this. So this is obviously Europe. In Asia, we get Japanese reconstruction. So Japan, just like Europe, is destroyed by 2 nuclear bombs and a lot of United States bombing. So the U.S. implements a sort of leader of the country, an executive military governor. This person is Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur is the leader of the Asian sort of theater of the war, and he will become a very, very strict reformer of Japan. He will mandate to bring democracy, and he has the trials of Tokyo, which execute 2 Japanese leader in prison. I think it's 47, and it exiles about 107 or so. So it is very harsh reconstruction, just like we saw with the North and the South in Japan as well. So the Chinese Revolution. So China has their own revolution after Japan leaves. The communists will win in China. So the communists will defeat the nationalists, and Mao Zedong gets put into power. So Mao Zedong is one of the probably the more hated figures in U.S. political spectrum. Well, not spectrum, really, just diplomacy. China has very sort of adversarial affairs with us, and eventually they will be sort of mended, not really fixed. Even today, our relations with China are still not the best. But U.S. aid to the French. So this will also be very important. The U.S. aids the French in their fight for Vietnam. So during World War II, the Japanese take over Vietnam. The French want their colony back. So they go back to Vietnam, sort of fight the French out. The Vietnamese people are kind of like, we don't want this. Please go away, France. And they actually cite Wilson's 14 points to self-determination. And Wilson basically ignores him and says, go away. And this will lead the U.S. to aid the fight for France and Vietnam. There's actually a really good political cartoon where when America first enters Vietnam, there's a French soldier lying dead on the field. And it says, do not come here. And the American just steps over it. So, I mean, they had their warnings, but we obviously went to Vietnam after. So the McCarthyism that will sweep through the nation is a very, very important domestic policy you need to know. So who remembers what McCarthyism is? I know you know what it is. Torres, what is it? Yeah. So McCarthy goes to the Senate. So people are very, very scared. This is also called the Second Red Scare. People are very, very scared of communism and the threat it poses to the United States. So McCarthy, who is a senator, he goes to the whole Congress and says, I have a list of 200 people working in the government who are communist double agents. This number changes all the time, and it's basically just mass hysteria to convict people and basically political enemies. So Joseph McCarthy will blacklist a lot of people, a lot of members of the country, a lot of members of Congress. He will put a lot of people in prison without trial. They also start a special committee on anti-American affairs or anti-American activities. This will lead to the conviction of a lot of just non-government sympathizers who wind up in prison for just basically opposing the United States government. And McCarthy finally meets his end with the McCarthy Army hearings, where the army is, Dwight D. Eisenhower's army is much too much of a match for McCarthy to defeat. So McCarthy accused the army of being communist, and the army, with all of its funding and all of its public support, finally defeats Joseph McCarthy. So just know sort of the rise and fall of McCarthyism. A good SAQ question they like to ask a lot is, what's the difference between the first and the second Red Scare? Like, what's the continuity? What's the difference? So that's one you could see. So Truman's domestic policy, he is elected again in 1948. His sort of doctrine is not the most effective in the domestic field. Unemployment rises, inflation rises to about 20%, and we get the ideology of new conservatism. So Truman is a Democrat like those before him, and we start to see the rise of a conservative population. So the rise of the Republican Party, as we know it today, starts to come into fold of people saying the American dream, low tax rates, those sort of Reaganomics that will come into play, start to get on the rise with new conservatism. The United Mine Workers are also another thing that will show up. The United Mine Workers are just workers who go on strike. The army suppresses them, and this shows the government betrayal of the labor unions. So after all that time of the progressives propping up the labor unions, Truman will shun them down and will shut them down with sort of the United Mine Workers and the seizure of the mines. So this alienates a lot of the Democratic Party who supported the unions. So Truman basically has no shot of getting reelected in 1948. So he also creates the President's Committee on Civil Rights. So this is a mainly symbolic thing. It really didn't do anything, but it just reported the end of segregation. It called for the end of segregation and the end to poll taxes because they were unconstitutional in Truman's mind. They would not be declared unconstitutional until all the way down the road with sort of Brown v. Ed and the repealing of Plessy v. Ferguson. So this committee, it prohibits, so he enacts an executive order that prohibits segregation in the Army and in federal jobs. So that is probably one of the most monumental civil rights things Truman will do. Another thing that transpires is sort of the end of segregationist culture in some areas, baseball being one with Jackie Robinson. And Dixiecrats will also form, they are Southern Democrats who align themselves more with the Confederacy and sort of the old racist ways more than the new ways of the Democratic Party. So this is just early party switch. So Democrats are becoming what we would see them today as conservatives, and the actual Democrats who will lead into the Democratic Party will start to alienate themselves from the party itself. So the Taft-Hartley Act is also passed. It is passed even with a veto from Truman. So 2/3 of Congress, they're called the 80th Congress, one of the more conservative Congresses, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act. This is basically a huge, huge bust of unions. So there's no closed shops, there's very restricted strikes, and it is the government power to intervene with strikes. So a closed shop is sort of a union. So in order to participate in a closed shop, you'd have to be a member of the union. So the government puts an end to these closed shops. It also says that the government has the right to intervene in union strikes if it is a matter of national security and if it is a matter of the state, basically. So what is my last bullet there? I can't actually see it. So Truman will win the election of 48 in a big sort of switcheroo when he calls on the Congress to enact a bunch of laws that they can't enact, and he runs on sort of the grassroots campaign of a do-nothing Congress. Yeah, Moscow, you had a question?
Yeah, so going back to McCarthyism, so it's pretty much like him like saying out like, oh, you're a communist, and so basically people didn't like this obviously in Congress, and so who took him down?
Dwight D. Eisenhower. So the Army versus McCarthy trials will be the end of Joseph McCarthy in the Senate.
So, it was just a trial. It wasn't.
It was a trial. He loses all legitimacy. He loses all his credibility after the trial.
Who was he like? How was he in the government?
He's a senator. Yeah.
So you said that after the unemployment rate rising, the United Mine Workers.
Yeah. No, I accidentally. So. Yeah. So it looks like there's like no shot this guy's gonna get reelected, and then so the Republican convention happens, or whatever the conservative convention happens, and they lay out what they want to do with their party, and the Congress goes into recess before the presidential election. Obviously, they go on break. So what Truman does, it's a very smart political move. He calls the Congress back, this very conservative Congress. He calls them back from their break. And he says, you know all those laws you said you were just going to do? Do them. Do them now. Enact those laws. Pass those laws. obviously there's not enough time for them to pass these laws before the election. So Truman goes on sort of around the country and he says, look at these guys who aren't doing anything. Do you really want these guys to be in control of the federal government? So this works because it's a very smart political move. I'll give it to Truman, but it's very devious. Like, it's manipulative, obviously.
That was the president's committee on civil rights.
Yeah. So I like this photo as well. It's a political cartoon. It says, "Is this tomorrow? The American flag is burning. KGB agents are strangling the American people. Black men are fighting white men. A communist man is choking a woman." And so this obviously represents the sort of McCarthyist spirit of the time, where it's the enemy within. Like there could be a Soviet double agent in this room right now, and they've mastered their language skills so well, I don't even know who they are. You know, that was sort of the hysteria that was going on during the time. I never seen it. So the Korean War will start in 1950. So the Korean War is the communist North versus the democratic and Western propped up South. So Truman wants to seek reunification of the country. So after the communists attack the South, the North will get pushed back all the way, and then the North will start to push back all the way up to basically the Chinese border. Truman says, why stop? Let's reunify the whole peninsula. And the Chinese basically come in and they were worried that the Americans were going to just keep going. So the Chinese will come in on the support of the North Koreans just because they're worried that they will keep going into their country. So this is where the Korean War will return to its stalemate as it was over there. So the South really does kind of gain land, but only a little bit.
So Truman wanted to take over the whole time.
Yeah, Truman was just like, why are we waiting? Let's just take the whole country. It doesn't matter. It could have worked. Honestly, if China doesn't get involved in the war, Truman probably does reunite the peninsula. So Douglas MacArthur, he comes back. So Douglas MacArthur says, why waste time? Let's just go to war with China right now. Who cares? We can take them. We have nukes. They don't. He says, let's reinstate Chiang Kai-shek. He is the Chinese nationalist leader. And he says, why are we wasting time? Why are we letting China become strong? Let's just take them out while they're weak. And Truman says, Douglas MacArthur, you are crazy. Get out of here. I'm not starting another war with this very strong nation where a lot of Americans are going to die. And he fires Douglas MacArthur. And Douglas MacArthur is really, really loved back home. So this hurts Truman politically a lot. So Truman will be very politically hurt from the firing of Douglas MacArthur. So Dwight D. Eisenhower will replace him. And Dwight D. Eisenhower will become the elected president in 1952. He is a war hero, and so that allows him to be swept into the popularity of the presidential election. So the Eisenhower years. So the 1950s, or the time of Eisenhower, is seen as a cultural time of conformity. So people are diving back into the traditional American lifestyle, like the conformist sort of thing, like people dress nicely. The role of woman is to be sort of in service to their husbands and also to their sons, their daughters, those sort of things. Those conformist values will take a hold in America during the 50s, and it will really cause the counterculture of the 60s. So the consensus of values. What is consensus? Who knows what that means?
Like the common consensus, like agreement.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, people said that, at the end of the day, even though we have some political divides between Republican and Democratic, at the end of the day, we still all value American liberty, American freedom, free speech, such things as that. And that becomes the consensus of values. Another pretty important consensus of value is communism is evil. So that is a very also important consensus of value. Everyone seemed to agree that communism was very, very evil.
You agree with that statement?
No. So consumerism. So consumerism also rises out of this conformity. So consumerism is just saying that consumers have protecting the consumer's right to purchase the goods they want to purchase. So this will rise out of our era of conformity. Accesses to modern conveniences, so just accessing to the goods you want to purchase. Yeah, Jason?
Wait, it says, oh, never mind. I thought that said consumerism is evil.
No. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, with his sort of military background, he will enact the GI Bill of Rights. So the GI Bill of Rights, it is basically a lot of just rights for veterans. So veterans are afforded an allowance for their education and living for veterans living through college and high school. So veterans who want to complete their college career, it's paid for by the government. So this fuels the American dream that will rise out of the 60s and the 70s, because these young men, these 18, 19-year-old men, return back from war. They return from Europe. Their education is funded for them. So we get a large rise of the business class, especially. So this is where we get that sort of really strong bolstered middle class. So domestic policies in the 1950s. Dwight D. Eisenhower's years are riddled with sort of a lot of race riots and a lot of racial tensions. So these will lead into the civil rights movement. So Eisenhower's goals domestically, so in the US, was to balance the budget by cutting federal spending, easing government regulation of businesses. So in order to balance the budget, so spend as much as I'm earning, they had to cut federal spending and also ease the government regulation of businesses. So we're kind of taking a step backwards in the terms of government regulation, and this will play a role all the way into Reaganomics that will eventually occur with the supply side economy. Eisenhower also creates the New Look Army. So the New Look Army is basically just using all this technology, using all of this stuff that we've made recently to fuel a modernized army. So we will get a lot of cool planes out of this, a lot of ships, improved gun warfare, those sort of things that will rise out of the army. So in order to decrease military spending, I have to increase the technology that's used in the military, if that makes sense. So he also has the interstate highway system. So yeah, Jason?
How did they increase the technology with spending less?
So it's like if I spend $10 billion on a new robot that could replace bomb squads in Afghanistan.
Oh, so all that money.
Yeah, it's gonna replace like the $30 billion I'm spending on the personnel in Afghanistan. So I'm spending money to save money. So the interstate highway system will also form from Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Dwight D. Eisenhower in California, he takes his military convoys and he starts driving them to New York. A lot of them break down, a lot of them fall off the road, a lot of the bridges break. And Dwight D. Eisenhower says, okay, we need to fix our infrastructure. So the reason why he wanted to fix the infrastructure, because he wanted the ability to transport nuclear weapons across the country with ease and also be able to move the army around the country with ease. So in reaction to like a potential invasion or anything like that, he could move his 101st Airborne Division from Washington, D.C. to Washington or Oregon as quickly as he could using the highway system. This will eventually be used by the common people like us way more than it is actually used by the military. Yeah, so trade and commerce will also heavily rely on the system. If you remember, it's the same way the railroads impacted trade in the country, the highways will do the same thing.
It seems weird, but in the United States, like the vast majority of goods that are transported to be sold are transported by trucks, like truckers on the interstate highway system. That's how we move things around our country. The railroads are a relatively small number, same thing with ships going from port to port. It's happening in our country by truck.
Yeah.
Was his intention for it to be like that? Like it would help the economy, like transportation?
I'm sure his sort of Department of Infrastructure thought of that, but his main reason for funding it was the army thing. I'm sure he knew that there were going to be corollary benefits to it, but sort of the highest reason was that, and then I guess like a tertiary reason could also be the commerce and people aspect. So Dwight D. Eisenhower will also propose the termination of Native American reservations, sort of to assimilate them with the white culture. This is disastrous for Native American populations who will be thrown into poverty and who will be basically decimated following the termination of these reservations. The reservations are eventually reinstated, but this is really the final sword to the already limp body of the Native American population of the North Americans. So Brown versus education. It's also, this is one of the Supreme Court cases you need to know. So Brown v. Ed says that separate but equal is not equal. So saying that Black people can go to their own schools away from white people, that is not equal. So separate is not being equal. Thus, schools ought to desegregate. Brown v. Ed didn't actually do anything besides say it was unconstitutional. Well, what is actually a very important thing is as we watch sort of states desegregate their schools and integrate their schools, how that sort of will form. So Little Rock 9, as pictured in my top right image over here. So Little Rock 9 are actually a very interesting story. So after Brown v. Ed is instated, nine high schoolers from Arkansas or Alabama, I think it is. It's the South state. It doesn't really matter. I think it is out. Oh yeah, it is Arkansas. I was right the first time. I shouldn't have questioned myself. Yeah. So yeah, Arkansas. So basically, the governor of Arkansas, a very, very racist man, he says, "Get these Black people out of my school." He sends the National Guard to forcefully evict the Black people from the school. The National Guard will kick them out. Dwight D. Eisenhower says, I can't have this happen because this is decreasing my power in the federal government if I'm allowing the states to do whatever they want. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, he will federalize the Guard. So the National Guard, it's the states, but it's also run by the federal government. So he will say, your troops are now under my command, which is it's within his right to do as the president. He will take control of the Arkansas National Guard, and he will make them march them into the school in the face of a lot of white riots and a lot of sort of KKK elements. People will be throwing things at these little Black children. They'll be throwing things, spitting at them, hurling racial slurs. This really is where like photography and filmography will become a big use in the civil rights movement. Yeah, Moscow?
So at first, the governor of Arkansas took these kids out of the white school.
Yeah.
Right? And then, so Eisenhower said, no, this like whatever. And then, so the National Guard brought them back.
So Eisenhower will federalize the Guard. So in his right to be a president, he has certain executive powers.
Yep.
So the National Guard that it once worked for the governor now works for the president. So he will say, your troops are now mine, and your troops must protect these people from the school. Dwight D. Eisenhower actually sent the 101st Airborne Division, if anyone's familiar. It's actually a very famous division, very elite squad of paratroopers in to protect these kids as they walk into school. If you look, these kids are literally holding the American flag as they walk in. So they're saying, why are you treating me differently? I'm just American as you. And the hurl of white riots and white racial slurs especially. So another thing that will come into effect is the Montgomery bus boycotts. So after Rosa Parks gets kicked off of the buses, a lot of Black people organized by Martin Luther King will boycott the bus line, eventually leading to a Supreme Court case in which mass transportation ought to be desegregated because it is unconstitutional. And this will lead to the rise of prominence of Martin Luther King, as well as a lot of peaceful protests in the South. So the one pictured below is a peaceful protest. It's called a sit-in. So these people would literally just sit in a white-only diner, sit there, do nothing else, and they would get absolutely hated on by other people. So if you see here, it is literally people dumping milkshakes and food on the Black people just simply sitting at the counter. So peaceful protests will be used as a means of racial justice in those sort of outlets. So America versus the communists. So John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State under Dwight D. Eisenhower, will establish more forms of doctrine. Know these words. They will come up on like a unit test for this chapter. So you need to know containment. So containment but liberation. So we will contain communism. We will keep it where it is, but we will also liberate the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern countries under communism from communist rule. So we'll contain these states, but we're also going to liberate them. Another word is massive retaliation. If you had to guess what massive retaliation is, what do you think it would mean? Yeah? Big backfire. Sure, that works. So basically, this said, if you nuke me, I'm going to send all my nukes and kill you. So that is basically what will lead to mutually assured destruction. So deterrence also factors in there. Deterrence is saying, I will not go to war with this person because they have the weapons in which that could utterly destroy me. So if you see my little political cartoon here, it is two armies firing bow and arrows at them, and then the nukes say on them, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. So no nuke will ever be used in the Cold War for fear of retaliation from the other country. So brinkmanship is another word you should know. It's just a policy by the U.S. to coerce the Soviets into backing down militarily. So it is like a sort of second strike thing, like fail-safes. If the U.S. gets nuked, we have automatic systems that will immediately nuke Russia. So if the Soviets nuke us, we have immediate sort of implications that will, in fact, nuke them. So that will be the second strike or the brinkmanship sort of deterrence. Another buzzword is the domino theory. So the domino theory says that if one country falls to communism, all the rest of the countries will fall. So this is where we see why we see a lot of U.S. intervention in places like Vietnam, places like Korea, because they thought if one of these countries fell to communism, it will lead to a lot more other countries to fall to communism. So if Vietnam falls to communism, that means Laos, Indonesia will all fall to communism. So this was like our sort of, domino effect is really the best term for it. So the death of Stalin and the rise of Nikolai Khrushchev. So Stalin will die from a brain aneurysm in 1953, and Khrushchev will take over. Khrushchev denounced Stalinization, which will lead to revolts in Hungary and Poland, but he immediately reenacts a sort of totalitarianism. He takes away from Stalinization, but he enacts his own sort of totalitarian state. So the Soviet Union isn't really reformed in this period, it's just de-Stalinized. De-Stalinized is a term that likes to be thrown around with it especially. So when he denounced Stalinization, it was seen as a weakness in the Eastern Bloc, and we get a lot of riots, we get a lot of protests from Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, and these will all be militarily put down and suppressed. A lot of people will die from these protests, killed by Soviet agents.
Wait, what does it mean to be de-Stalinized? Like, what did he like exactly change?
I mean, like, in effect, he just kind of got rid of like Stalinist policies, and he got rid of Stalin statues. So like I don't like the Great Purge, like the Euro guys might know that. When Stalin will purge all of his high command officials because he thinks that they're all paranoid against him. They think it was all against him. So a lot of policies were put in place to keep people from rising to power in his own staff. So Nikolai Khrushchev will get rid of those policies, and he will have sort of a cabinet, but it's still a dictatorship, obviously. So the arms race. So the arms race will occur where the USSR and the Americans will sort of compete to see who can get the most nuclear warheads in the least amount of time. The Soviets win eventually. In 1980, 9 years before the Soviets will fall, the USSR will have 30,000 nuclear warheads, while the US will only have 20,000. The amplitude of these nukes may be different, but in the end, the Soviets will win the arms race, even though they're never to be used in an actual battle. Another thing is space race. So obviously, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite into space. This is a big blow to American public morale because the Soviets, the communists, are beating us. Maybe they are better. And so NASA is created, and we get sort of the space race. So we get First man to the moon, Neil Armstrong, 1969. Sputnik is launched in 53, but it will occur over 15 years or so. Yeah, Lardy?
What about the Miracle on Ice?
That's another thing. It's a cultural thing. You could bring it up.
They beat Russia.
Yeah.
You could bring up the miracle on ice.
I know what happened, but I don't know the
It's not supposed to be.
Sure. So third world politics will also form. So the rise of the third world country. So these countries, after being freed from British, well, not British imperial rule, like period. So a lot of African countries, they will become sort of nationalized. So they will get their own spirit for their country. So, let me think of an African country. So like Chad. So people of Chad will feel spirit for their country and will say, "Yay, Chad!" And they will also be wary of both communist and capitalist sympathies. So they will be wary of U.S. intervention as well as Soviet intervention, because obviously the U.S. was not kind to its Latin American friend. Neither is the Soviets kind to their Eastern Bloc puppets. So these third world countries will be very cautious of the two, but mainly they did side with the United States and their economic aid packages.
It's also a way of leveraging.
Yeah. Friends for money.
Like the first world is the United States, the second world is the Soviets, and the third world are the people in between. And so if you're kind of in between, you can kind of sell yourself to the highest bidder.
So like people would like.
Pardon the interruption. Will Matthew Arancibia please come to the main office?
So like third world
Matthew
countries would like
Arancibia, please come to the
kind of
main
like
office.
almost bet on themselves and like who would like benefit them more, and then they would side on that side.
Yeah, so let's use Egypt as an example. So Egypt needs to build a dam in the Nile River for energy. So the Aswan Dam, which will be created by the U.S., is a dam that needs to happen in Egypt for their energy sector to run very efficiently. So Egypt kind of says, okay, which one of these countries is going to help me the most? And they sort of put it out there. The U.S. says, I will help you, my friend. And the Brits say they'll help them also. So they build this dam. Egypt gets aligned with the Allies, and the Allies will take control of the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal is a strategic canal in Egypt. So, I mean, I don't want to assume anything. We know where Egypt is, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, did someone say nuh-uh? So, do you know where Africa? Do you know where Africa is? Do you know where Africa is? So it is the northeast of Africa. Yeah, top or northeast.
Right next to Saudi Arabia.
It will connect. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Strait, to the Indian and Pacific Ocean. So this is a very, very important thing for trade especially, and access militarily. Thus, the Allies want control of this canal. So the CIA covert ops. So the CIA becomes more of a assassination army more than it is a spy army. So Cuba, which is a country below Florida, it's a Long Island. Cuba will start to rise it will rise to be a big figure in Latin America. Fidel Castro especially, he will say, I mean, if you remember, since the Platt Amendment, a lot of Cuba is kind of owned by Americans. So Castro says, who are these? Why are these Americans in my country? Let's kick them out. He gets a bunch of guns and he gets a bunch of friends. He overthrows the Cuban leader at the time. He says, I'm the leader now. And he will lead the Cuban state towards the Soviet Union and as an adversary to America. The CIA will attempt 638 measures and plots on the life of Fidel Castro. None of them will be successful. One time they even try to poison his milkshake, which does not work. And a lot of the, it's not really real. A lot of the, like, they sent a lot of seducers. Like, they sent a lot of very beautiful women spies to seduce Fidel Castro and kill him. What ended up happening is Fidel Castro would seduce the actual seducer. And so they would get sort of Stockholm syndrome for Fidel Castro. It happened a lot too. Like, it wasn't just one thing. Like, it happened to like 10, 15 people. So
14 girls go in there. No, the first 14 happen.
so 1960 rolls around and we get the election of John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy will be the new sort of young spirit of America and the counterculture spirit, and he will be elected into office. JFK is our youngest president ever, I believe at 37 years of age, 38, 35. Who? He's one of the younger ones, all right?
The catch there is that Theodore Roosevelt was
That's
elected.
not true.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't elected.
No, he got into office after the assassination.
I mean,
Roosevelt was 42, Kennedy was 43.
So Kennedy was 43. Kennedy's vice president will be Lyndon B. Johnson, who will eventually take over the presidency after JFK's assassination. And
Yeah, no, that actually is. So we were actually like 639 in them.
yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So in the final days before Eisenhower leaves office, he warns the U.S. people and the U.S. Sort of officials and politics at the time. He says, guys, I think there's sort of a military-industrial complex forming with our government, so just be careful about this. And Eisenhower will end up being right. So the military-industrial complex is basically profiteering off of war. Don't get it confused with war profiteering. So it's basically just fighting for high-value government military contracts for billions of dollars. Trying to think of, I think not Boeing, but it's something like that is one of the top ones. They make like fighter jets for billions and billions of dollars, and this sort of profiteering off of war will lead to people lobbying for war. So if you think about the war hawks, instead of war with Mexico, think of it as war for money. So Eisenhower will be right, and the military-industrial complex will lead to wars such like Vietnam, Iran, Afghanistan, such things like that. So we get into an age called the turbulent 60s. So the turbulent 60s is obviously a time of vast change. So we get civil rights movements, we get JFK's assassination, and we get a plethora of other things. So JFK campaigns on the new frontier. The new frontier is saying that we are going to conquer poverty, racism, and all the other woes of our country. So JFK focuses a lot more on our people domestically than foreign affairs. In his actual presidency, this will not be true, but this is the campaign he runs on. If you remember the speech, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Another famous JFK speech is Ich bin ein Berliner, or I am a Berliner, as he preaches as the wall goes up, I believe. No, it might be Lyndon B. Johnson. But JFK does that speech saying that he does not approve of the divide over Berlin. So the Cuba crisis. So the rising force of the Cuban Communist Party and those sort of things worries the U.S. because instead of the closest communist threat being oceans away in the Soviet Union, the closest communist threat is now right like 300 miles from Florida. So Cuba is very, very close to us, and this obviously worries us. So not yet. So this is just a crisis of Cuba. So it will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but not as of yet. So the Bay of Pigs invasion. So JFK gets a bunch of Cuban nationals, got a lot of the businessmen who got kind of kicked out of Cuba. He'll arrange them together. He'll give them guns, and he'll say, "Okay, go invade Cuba." It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It utterly fails. It's terrible for public support, especially. It's also terrible because it just doesn't work. It's an operation that drastically fails militarily. And this will, yeah, there are a few mercenaries and those types of things. This will push Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union. So if you imagine Cuba standing on a tightrope, already leaning to the Soviet Union,
May I have your attention, please? Matthew, Aaron,
the U.S. will come in with the Bay of Pigs invasion and push the Cubans to the arms of the ever so loving Soviet Union. So the Berlin Wall will also get put up during this time. In response to the Berlin Wall, JFK will do the Ich bin ein Berliner speech, or I am a Berliner, I am a donut. But the Soviets put up the wall because of sort of the US's policy regarding the Eastern Bloc. So the policy that will be called, it's called openness. And this will lead to the Soviets sort of cracking down on immigration from East Berlin to West Berlin and immigration between Soviet countries. So the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in response to the Russians putting missiles inside of Ukraine because we put missiles in Turkey, there will be a naval blockade of Cuba. It's not technically a blockade, but it really is a blockade. So the U.S. says that we have the right to search any ship that's going to enter Cuban waters and enter the country of Cuba, especially any Russian ship. So this is seen as a declaration of war on the Soviets, basically. They're right at the tipping point of war. There's a nuclear sub in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. It's a Soviet sub. It's a nuclear submarine. 2 of the 3 of the commanders already thought they were at war with the United States. They all turned their keys, and they needed one more key to launch a nuclear missile on the city of Miami. And the highest ranking officer refused to turn his key to send a nuclear bomb. So secret talks will lead to the sort of devolving of the conflict. So Kennedy, or JFK's brother, will talk to Khrushchev, and they will ease the tensions between the two, and it will absolve the crisis. Yeah, Jason?
This like blockade that you're just talking about, like, which wasn't really a blockade, but you did say that America was able to search every like.
Yeah. So it's a block. So technically, by international law, a blockade is a declaration of war. So it's a blockade that's not really like. Effectively, it was a blockade, but they can't call it a blockade because that would mean war with the Soviets. But also, they don't want any Soviet ships going to Cuba, so they search all the ships going into Cuba for any missiles, any weapons or armaments like that. And if they have armaments in them, they say turn around and go back from where you came. So that's what we'll form out of that.
If you want to watch a movie, watch 13 Days. It's a really good movie that tells the story.
So is it kind of like, it's not directly like what we're doing with Ukraine now, but like it's a little similar how we're like sending over supplies, but not military supplies.
We are sending military supplies. We just gave them like 100 howitzers. And you're right, it creates a problematic situation.
Not sending over military supplies.
Like we're not sending nukes. We're not sending missiles.
Or we're not like doing the not the airfield, but it's like, what's it? You stop the all the air.
No fly zone?
A no fly zone. That's what it is. Like we're not.
You
not
stop.
No fly zone.
Yeah.
No fly zone would be one.
So that's pretty much like the blockade.
Yes. The selling of or the giving of weapons is also problematic because at some point the Russians will say you got to stop that too.
Okay.
They're giving weapons to who?
No, he's
talking about
Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay, back to the Cubans. So this is a U.S. sort of thing. So this is played on a lot of televisions, and this increases paranoia in the Americas. People are like going crazy about the Cuban threat, and so that causes the Cuban Missile Crisis, and eventually it will be sort of decayed, and the tensions will be eased between the two leaders. Basically, the phone call between Robert Kennedy Jr. and Khrushchev is basically, Khrushchev says, if you remove your missiles from Turkey, we'll remove our missiles from Cuba. And so they start slowly removing their missiles from both places, and that will absolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah.
Why do they trust each other? Like, why do they trust that they're not just gonna lie to each other and keep them?
I mean, if not, it's nuclear annihilation.
Matthew, Aristide, please come to the main office. Matthew, Aristide, please come to
So JFK's domestic policy before he is assassinated. So the New Frontier, So his promises of getting rid of poverty, his promises of getting rid of other woes, it will increase benefits, Social Security, minimum wage, and it will be a precursor to Lyndon B. Johnson's sort of quasi New Deal. So women's rights, he passes the Equal Pay Act of 1963. The Equal Pay Act means that women and men ought to get paid the same amount of money for the same job. Okay, let's just leave it at that. So the Civil Rights Act will be drafted by JFK, but he is assassinated before he can pass it. So Lyndon B. Johnson will pass it for JFK. JFK gets assassinated by Harvey Lee Oswald. That's all you need to know. So Lyndon B. Johnson's social agenda. So Lyndon B. Johnson will pass the Civil Rights Act, basically saying that the government and people ought not be able to discriminate based on sex, religion, gender, race. Race is the big one, obviously. Sexual orientation, anything of that sort of character it means. This is obviously a big step in the movement of Black liberation. And one of the SIQs I actually saw in this was, did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 fulfill the promises of Reconstruction? And honestly, pretty much did. Yeah.
So like JFK started and B. Johnson.
Yeah, JFK is like about to like sign it and send it to Congress, and he gets shot in the back of the head by Harvey Lee Oswald. So that's a little unfortunate for him. So Lyndon B. Johnson will also create the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So this commission, the EEOC, Moscow, no disruptive talking. So the EEOC will be created to enforce the Civil Rights Act. So they will enforce the Civil Rights Clause of it and say that you may not discriminate race, gender, sexual orientation for the workplace as well. He also passes the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in response to the Jim Crow laws of the South that have prohibited Black people from voting. So this bans the poll tax, it bans voter intimidation, and it sets voting up as it is today. So Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty is also created. During this sort of period, you see a lot of war on. So if you see like war on drugs, war on poverty, war on homelessness. So this thing is just being against homelessness and increasing benefits or increasing whatever it is to sort of sweep it of the country. So get rid of homelessness by creating homes, something like that. It's an idea. So he starts the Economic Opportunity Act. It is $1 billion for poverty relief. He starts Project Head Start, which allows people of like poor people, Black people especially, to go to preschool. He starts the Job Corps, which helps poor people look for jobs. Legal services for the poor, so legal assistance for poor people. And the Department of Housing and Development, or the HUD, as it's called, which will build sort of not tenements, apartments, affordable housing. The projects is what it's also called modernly. He will also pass the first sort of legislation of Medicare. So Medicare will act as the precursor to Obamacare, and Medicare is important. It's good. So this will also be the quote Great Society. So Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society will be one devoid of racism. It will be one of the great American spirit, the American dream, the rich, not the rich people, but you can have a home, you can have kids, you can have a very nice wife, very nice house, and that is the Great Society. So the civil rights movement under Lyndon B. Johnson is one of a lot of tension before the passage of the act. So the Warren Court, Warren is the Chief Supreme Court Justice. The Warren Court will seek to enforce voting rights for all Black people. So there is a lot of court cases that will come up, and the court will support Black people and Black liberation especially. So just know, if you get a question on the Marshall Court, if you remember, or if you get a question on the Warren Court, just follow the trends of that specific court. So Miranda versus Arizona is another Supreme Court case. This is our Miranda rights. If anyone knows, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you do or say can and will be used against you in the court of law. That is the Miranda rights, and they will be passed. The Ku Klux Klan has increased activity following the Civil Rights Amendment, and there will be a lot of racial violence, especially in the South. So lynchings in the South will occur. Emmett Till, for one, is one example of the Ku Klux Klan. Do not throw that. Michael, don't throw it. Olam, don't throw that. So Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm X is sort of MLK if he were violent. That is basically the way you can think of that for the AP course. Malcolm X is one of the prominent figures in the Nation of Islam. It is a place that thought that black equality could only be achieved through violence if necessary. So black power is creating institutions, creating like arms, housing for black people in sort of a scheme to get equality. This will also be the Black Panthers, if anyone's familiar in California. So the sixes. So the New Left, feminism, countercultural form out of this. We get the Students for a Democratic Society. They will support the free speech movement. So basically we see the New Left. So the New Left, it's a shift from the sort of old progressives to a younger base of students who want sort of liberal policies. So we will see the shift from a old sort of drawn out progressive policy to the new sort of kids of the decade. So this movement goals is the elimination of poverty, racism, and end to Cold War politics. So the Students Democratic Society is basically seen as our precursor to the leftist, more democratic socialist party today. So the free speech movement is the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment would mean that men and women have equal rights. It is passed by Congress, but it is never ratified by all the states, so it is not law, but it is passed. Now, or the National Organization for Women is also a key figure in the passage of the act. We get the Stonewall riots, or the gay lesbian rights riots that occur in New York City. Roe v. Wade is another thing that gets passed during this era, protecting the woman's rights to abortion. Counterculture will also form out of this. So if you remember, if you think of the 50s as a time of conformity, think of the 60s as a time of counterculture. So counterculture includes like hippies, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, all these people. They supported nonconformity and unconventionality. So the Clean Air Act of 1955 and 1970 also get packed, just giving more rights to the EPA to regulate pollution outputs and those sort of things. So American involvement in Vietnam. So for Euro guys, this is probably the important part. So history of Vietnam. Vietnam starts as a French colony. After World War II, Japanese conquer the territory, and then after the end of the war, when Japan falls, France wants their colony back. But Ho Chi Minh and Woodrow Wilson meet, and he says, hey, I saw your 14 points. I saw your point about self-determination. My country doesn't want to be a French colony anymore. And Wilson basically ignores him, tells him, shoo, go away. And Ho Chi Minh will eventually lead the Democratic Rebellion Party of the Vietnam. So Vietnam gets divided according to the Geneva Accords. If you see, you guys can see the screen, right? Where's the lamp in the one? So the northern region, the red region, is North Vietnam. Those are the communists. And the lower region, or the green region, is our South Vietnam, or our democratic capitalist U.S. ally, Western ally region. So the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, is formed out of this. SEATO is basically an alliance of Indonesia, South Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand to protect the economic and political rights of the region. So it will act as sort of a military alliance that will lead the West into Vietnam. So American involvement in Vietnam. So America pursues a strategy of total victory. That means they will not leave the soil of Vietnam until they conquer the entire Vietnamese region and give it back to the South Vietnamese people. Obviously, this does not work out and does not come into fold. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is passed by the United States Senate. It allows the president to put ground troops into Vietnam. So it allows the president to enact military sort of expeditionaries or military volunteers into other countries through his will. So the War Powers Act will eventually get passed after this, limiting the president's right to just sort of declare war without congressional approval. So the war for Vietnam, it's very important to know the shifts. So it starts out as sort of a not unpopular war. People were against it, people were for it. It was kind of split. Vietnam will turn into one of the most hated wars in American history by the American people at the time. So we will see a steady rise of protests, riots in America in response to the war, opposing the war. Yeah. So first ground troops arrive in Vietnam in 1965 from American soil. Operation Rolling Thunder occurs in Vietnam, where the American Air Force will napalm strike a lot of the Vietnamese people, killing thousands of civilians and leading to terrible, terrible war crimes to take place in Vietnam from the Americans' half. So the sort of Americanization of the war, if you see Americanization anywhere, that just means that they want to Americanize the people there. So give them democracy, give them American liberty, give them American freedoms. Those sort of things are the Americanization. Obviously, you can't have American liberty or freedom if you're dead. So that is why that's sort of called into question. So the My Lai massacre and the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive is the offensive of the Vietnamese against the southern region, and it is very, very successful against the Americans. So the Americans will succumb to the guerrilla warfare of the Vietnamese. In response, the My Lai massacre occurs. So the My Lai massacre is basically U.S. troops with their machine guns firing at elderly men, very old people, women, children, and a lot of non-combatants. They killed over 500 people in this town of My Lai indiscriminately for no reason. So this will be politicized and it will be brought back to the States, and this will lead to protests against the Vietnamese War becoming more ferocious, becoming more prevalent in the country. So this isn't just a hippie protest, this is now an American people protest. Due to the unpopularity of the war, the Americans will eventually pull out, but not yet. So the summer of 1968. So MLK is assassinated, as many of you know. This leads to humongous outrage throughout the country and even more riots. So if you think about it, we're already sort of on our tipping point with Vietnam, and now we have all these race riots. Now this whole bowl has tipped over. So America is kind of thrown into utter chaos from all the racial tensions, the Vietnamese tensions, the social changes that's going on. If you think about all these things that are happening, right? We have the civil rights movement. So we have racial tensions. We have social tensions. We have the counterculture versus the conformist culture. We have economic tensions between the poor and the rich. We have anti-war protests. So all of these things will lead to the sort of destabilization of America and will lead to the pulling out of the war eventually down the road. Yeah, Shankar? Yeah. So majority of the minority groups are largely opposed to the war before it even begins. So the death of Robert Kennedy. So Robert Kennedy, if you remember, is posed to take over the party, the Democratic Party, and he is shot and killed before he can do so, thus giving the election to Richard Nixon. So the alienation of Democratic voters. So the Democratic voters are even more alienated with the sort of Dixiecrat presidential run of Thurmond. So Thurmond will not be successful in his run. He will basically run as a Thurmond Strom. He will run on the platform of reinstating segregation. This is not obviously get put into effect.
He had been in the Senate for forever. He
So-
only died like relatively recently.
I don't know. So that obviously never gets put into effect. And I forgot to mention, if you look right there, you guys probably figured it out. That is napalm strikes. So napalm strikes just lead to mass death and a lot of infrastructure issues.
The Senate actually like advocated.
Yeah.
They're like a cheap kill streak. They're a cheap.
So the Equal Rights Amendment, as I mentioned before, it is passed by Congress, but is never enacted into law. So it is never ratified by enough states. So the party switch is another thing we see. Richard Nixon pursues the Southern strategy, which leads to Nixon sort of appealing to the Southern voters more than he appeals to the Democrats. So Democrats become the liberals, Republicans become the conservatives. This is what happens with the election of Richard Nixon. So Nixon, Vietnamization, and the D'Entente. So Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a name you should know. He 98 years old. He is still alive. No, he's not a good guy.
It might be simplistic. Maybe there's more nuance to it than that.
We actually, in this building, we actually have a quote of Henry Kissinger on the when you walk down the hallway.
Henry Kissinger is considered to be like the elder statesman of the United States, but not everybody likes him for good reasons. The one who was more unpopular than him with Vietnam is McNamara. McNamara is the one who more or less, like this is not a conspiracy theory. McNamara lied, and the lie was the seminal cause of the Vietnam conflict. The Gulf of Tonkin, the second Gulf of Tonkin incident, is a complete fabrication. That's not a tinfoil hat thing. McNamara has admitted that.
That's not good.
Yeah. So Kissinger organizes a peace in Vietnam for 1973. It is not really a peace. The fighting in Vietnam will not stop until the communists will win. The communists will take over the entire country. So the peace that Kissinger negotiates is not actually a peace. The fighting still sort of goes on in Vietnam until the communists eventually win. Congress passes the Wars Power Resolution in 1973. So if you know what I mentioned with the Gulf of Tonkin, that gave the president the authority to send troops where he pleased as a means of foreign policy. So the War Powers Resolution says that only Congress can approve for a war and can only approve for the expenditure of American troops for a conflict that is going to last more than 60 days. So this is obviously important when we get to Iraq, Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So Nixon also led to increased trade with the USSR. That's obviously a good thing for economic stability in the region for both us and them. D'Entente is also another sort of buzzword you should know with Nixon. It's a policy of openness and cooperation. So Nixon says, we're going to be open people. And Khrushchev says, yeah, let's be open people. Actually, I'd like to read you a excerpt from the two.
What's that one like debate they had on TV?
It's a kitchen debate. They haven't. That was the exact one I want to read, actually. So it's a funny.
I was there. Yeah, well,
I can't. Where is it?
yeah, we did Kishaw, we boys.
Kishaw? Khrushchev?
Khrushchev, yeah.
You said
Well, like,
Kishaw?
his friends call him Kishaw, but you wouldn't know that. We went over.
I want to find it because it's actually really interesting. If I can't find it in 2 seconds, I'll just move on. But I thought it was really interesting. I liked it actually.
Like we're like Dixon, like we have all this, and everybody in America enjoys all this. It's like one word.
No, basically what he says is, look at this new kitchen appliance we made to make the kitchen work easier for a woman. And Khrushchev says, we don't do that here. And he says, what do you mean? What do you mean? Do you guys just let them work with knives and spoons? He says, no, we don't keep the woman in the kitchen. And so that is basically their interaction on TV. Yeah, so that is basically
Who said don't keep women?
Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. We don't keep them in the cushion. We just keep them in the gulags. That's what really gets across. So so the Nixon Doctrine. So the Nixon Doctrine is that the U.S. would withdraw any overseas commitments. So Nixon saw how unpopular all these wars were, and he said, let's just get rid of all of them. Let's get rid of our troops in these foreign countries, and let's pull them all back. So Nixon's domestic policy. So Nixon's domestic policy, the economy really worsened. The economy will go down, increase inflation, decrease in productivity. These types of things will lead to the sort of deflation of the economy. We get the Kent State University riot. No, not riot, I guess. A protest is the right word. Mass shooting might also be a good word. The National Guard is called to deal with the free speech movement's protest, peaceful protest, I mind you. The National Guard will shoot and kill 4 people. They will shoot and kill 4 college students for peacefully protesting. So the photo is actually really gruesome if you look at it. This is a dead body. This is a student like only a year or 2 older than us who was literally just shot and killed by the military for no reason.
Well,
this is
was
another.
that actually for no reason.
They held signs, shot him, and they said, "We don't like you." Like if you actually look, like it's the military with shotguns and gas masks walking on a picket line. So that is basically what occurs. It's terrible for.
The Crosby, Stills and Nash song, Ohio. Not gonna sing it, but yes, you heard this song. You've heard it. It's popular. He writes it.
So the Kent State shooting will look very, 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 very bad for Nixon, and it really does affect his domestic policy. Another thing that affects Nixon's domestic policy, dun dun dun, Watergate. So Watergate is Nixon bugging the DNC. So Nixon bugs the DNC. He is caught by a plumber. It's basically someone who is plumbing the government of corruption. He put the Pentagon Papers are another thing that the Pentagon says like, I think it's something along the lines of like the war like in Vietnam meant nothing or something like that. You can look actually specifically, but just know the Pentagon Papers are really bad for Nixon back home. So let me look. The Pentagon Papers. It's a top secret government study of the U.S. history involvement in Vietnam. This study documented the numerous military miscalculations and flat out lies the government told the people. This will look terrible for Richard Nixon, and Watergate will cause Nixon to resign. So Nixon will resign, and he will hand the presidency back to Lyndon B. Johnson. Or no, Gerald Ford. Sorry. Not Lyndon B. Johnson, Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford also then gets the notoriety of being the only president in American history never to be elected.
Yeah. So Gerald Ford, as soon as Gerald Ford gets into office, he says he pardons Nixon. So he says, no, Nixon didn't do any crimes. It's all right. Just let him be. Some people call this a deal that they'd worked out. So Gerald Ford's popularity dramatically decreased. He has win pins. Wipe inflation now. Because inflation was going on at such a high rate, that did not get him the support he really wanted it to get him. I'll get to that in a second. So an oil embargo from the Arab nations, or OPEC, will lead to an increased inflation and the increasing of oil prices in the Americas, leading to more economic troubles in the country. And Chevy Chase, comedian on SNL, he really nails the head into the coffin of Gerald Ford's presidential run for the next election, like terribly. It's not going to work well. He goes on SNL. You're all familiar, right? What SNL is. Imagine like the Donald Trump impersonations. They just portray Gerald Ford as this like utterly incompetent buffoon who's just playing around in the Oval Office and he has no clue what he's actually doing. If you see, he's supposed to be on the phone. He's supposed to be on the phone with Khrushchev, and he's using the glass of water in front of him as a phone, and it spills all over him.
It's funny because he thinks the glass is a telephone.
Ah.
Now you get it.
If you watch the thing, it's actually very funny.
It's all in the delivery.
So we get to Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy C is our first elected Democrat in a while. So Jimmy Carter will run on a policy of home improvements. So Jimmy Carter's economic inheritance is stagflation. Ms. Jess, would you like to take that one? Or sticky wages?
Stagflation is when you have a recession and prices going up at the same time. It's very bad because you have inflation and unemployment, and the regular remedies to fix it don't actually work. So normal fiscal policy, normal monetary policy. The cause of stagflation is usually a negative hit to the supply. So in the case of Jimmy Carter, it was the oil embargo. So oil is an input, like it's used in the manufacturing of pretty much everything. So just like right now, when the price of gas goes up, like it affects the entire economy. Everything in some way, in some amount is affected by the price of gas. When OPEC and the Iranians in particular stopped selling oil to the United States, it created a very serious problem for our economy. So prices go up, unemployment goes up, gas rationing, which might or might not continue to return, was a real thing. So like, I don't know if any of you, when you drive, you look at the gas tanks, they've kind of suspiciously, the last couple of months, added a little line onto the gas tank that says maximum purchase.
300.
Was that 200? Yes, well, yesterday it was 150.
It was 300 like 2 weeks ago.
And if it keeps going down, that will be the return of gas.
I drove a Tahoe, it's
Yeah.
gonna be 85.
But like the point is, stagflation is a really, really bad and unusual economic situation. Prices go up and unemployment goes up at the same time. So the government kind of has to choose, what do we protect the economy from, inflation or unemployment? And usually, like, inflation has got to be protected and people will just be unemployed. But it's caused by a real world shock. It's caused by oil prices.
Our fake money thing is more important than people starving.
I need to take money.
Yeah.
So why did the Arab nations put the oil in the
I don't got the United States.
The short answer, actually,
Just for shit.
so
The leader we put in there.
King is overthrown by the current like Islamic Republic of Iran. So that would be like the Ayatollahs, right? You've heard that word, right? So like when they come through, they kick the Iranian government out. They start a fundamentalist theocracy. The United States have been a close ally to the Shah. When the Shah was in need of medical attention, he came to the United States. He's basically seen as like a puppet of the Western countries. It's actually really frightening. If you look at images of Iran, like Google, like Iranians living before the revolution, it looks like a westernized country, like women walking around without burqas, wearing mini skirts, going to college, and then like compare that to what happens after the Iranian Revolution, and that's where you start to see the images of Iran that you'd be familiar with today. Where women by law are required to, cover their bodies and education is restricted and so on. But that's the problem.
So Jimmy Carter, to sort of ease the oil embargo, will create the Department of Energy, and he will look for a lot of energy alternatives. So one big energy alternative is nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is really popular until 3 Mile Island. So the 3 Mile Island plant will be a disaster for the nuclear energy arbiters. And even today, nuclear energy is way more safe, and it is the same safety as it was with Jimmy Carter. But people are so frightened of nuclear energy because of places like Fukushima or the 3 Mile Island.
It's going to come up again. People are going to make a push, and maybe rightfully so, to start bringing back nuclear energy.
So the 6-Day War is also a piece of important policy with Jimmy Carter. So the 6-Day War is a war between Israel and Egypt, and so basically Israel versus the Arab nations. over control of the sort of canal and control of the region. Israel will be backed by the United States, and basically both parties will sit at the table at Camp David, and Jimmy Carter will negotiate a peace. Obviously, this peace doesn't last long, as many of you do know, of tensions in the Middle East, but he still negotiates some peace there. That's probably,
The Israelis win. I don't know if you said
yeah,
that.
you know,
The Israelis basically clean up. It's a 6 days war. Like it's like a shocker to the world that Israel kind of so easily handles the Arab countries, and they still possess some of the land that they claimed from that. And that's one of the issues when people talk about Israel today. So it's Palestine and some of the confiscated things from the 6 days war.
So another piece of important American foreign policy that goes on is the hostages in Iran. So American hostages will be, or American people will be taken hostages in Iran, journalists, tourists, those sort of things. And the U.S. government will have to negotiate those people back. So this is seen as sort of the low point and failure of Jimmy Carter's presidency. The hostages, I think, come back.
Yeah,
We get.
If you never saw the movie Argo, yeah, so that tells the story of the Iranian Revolution. It's actually like a really, really good movie. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. In the movie Argo, it's a real CIA plan to get some of the people who are in hiding, who are not yet hostages, like they were hiding in the Canadian embassy. Yeah. They smuggle them out of the country. The actual hostages, I mean, obviously, if you're a hostage, like you care that you're a hostage. The significance of it to like this period of American history is that it becomes like a point of nationalism. That Jimmy Carter can't get the hostages back is a real problem for people. On the day of Reagan's inauguration,
Gets them back.
are released.
Yeah.
And a
So
lot of people like use that as kind of the mythos of like Ronald Reagan, like more or less just by his leadership, inspired enough fear in the Iranians that it was time to do this.
So arms negotiations between the Soviet Union and the U.S. also go on. So limiting arms and those sort of things goes on with Jimmy Carter as well. Jimmy Carter is also the keystone of promoting human rights and foreign policy. Does he succeed? I don't know. But he promoted human rights. So
He's still alive too.
yeah.
He's dead.
That is Unit 8.
That was a dense units.
Well, we're not done.
Unit 9 is 3 slides, I think. So, yeah.
That was a really dense unit. A lot of stuff. Jimmy, that was a great movie.
15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Oh, well, there's an SEQ. So I'd say like 30, 45 minutes. Yeah. 30, 40 minutes. All right, sit down. No break. Let's go. I want to go home. Sit down. No, I can't chop the video. I don't know how. So, entering the 21st century. So this is, no talking. This is the period 1980 to the present. So we're going from the inauguration of Richard Nixon all the way to the COVID-19 pandemic. What did I say? I said Ronald Reagan. No, I said Ronald Reagan. Okay, it's whatever. So Reagan, HW, Clinton, and the W. So the Reagan presidency and candidacy. So Reagan markets himself as an outsider. He says, I am not of the deep entrenched Washington bureaucrats. I'm an outsider, so elect me. He is a conservative, and he wins in one of the most landslide victories in U.S. history, obviously with the exception of George Washington. Reagan championed supply-side economics. So supply-side economics is basically just increasing supply of goods translates to economic growth for the country. So the more I'm importing, the more I'm supplying to my country, the more economic good I'm having for my country.
The other part of that is to create incentives for businesses.
Yeah. So tax cuts.
Reagan's idea is sometimes called trickle-down economics. So the idea that like by saving the money at the top, it eventually filters down. Or voodoo economics.
Or the next point. So trickle-down economy. is saying that wealth will trickle down from the higher classes to the lower classes with supply side economics. This is not true. What happens with Reagan's economy is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So we start to see that large divide get even larger. So we see those top 1%ers really exponentially increase their. Yeah, Jimmy.
Why does it have an opposite effect?
What do you mean?
Because you're helping rich people.
No, he's lying. Trickle down economics is not true.
Okay.
He's just making it up to appease his poor voters.
I don't know if he's making it up. He thinks it's correct. Like
It's
you're
wrong.
presuming that he thinks it's
Yeah,
correct.
that's your opinion, right?
Like the advantage of the trickle down economics. Like one way you might want to look at it is if you Google top tax rate by year. So like in our country, we have tax brackets, right? And if you look at the top tax brackets by year, like you'll see like how low Reagan makes it. In other words, what he's trying to do is if you are a wealthy person, he wants to lower your taxes, and the idea is that you will go out and start a business, you'll expand your business, which will mean more people get employed, which will mean that like all of the, like all this stuff will rise together. The other thing it does, by the way, is bankrupt the Soviets.
So Reagan will market on the premise of business deregulation, and tax cuts. So the rich will get tax cuts in hopes that they give it the money to the poor through businesses. They do not do this. They hoard their money. And this leads to that gap ever so increasing. So Reagan seeks to combat military spending and budget deficits as well. So Reagan trademarks new federalism. Don't think of it as federalism. It is not federalism. It is the literal exact opposite of federalism.
Federalism is in like
So,
Federalist Republic.
yeah, of creating a strong centralized federal state. So Reagan makes new federalism. He makes it more of a states' rights thing. So he's shifting power from the federal government away to the states. So this greatly increases military spending and the federal budget deficit. So the Strategic Defense Initiative and the Space-Based Missile Program, two programs of Reagan, cost a lot of money militarily. So the Space Missile Program, some people call it Star Wars. It's basically space missiles, satellite missiles, that eventually gets funded. It's a waste of money, basically. Yeah. So it's just a lot more spending, a lot more debt to the country. So foreign policy under Reagan, we get the Iran-Contra affair. So the Iran-Contra affair is when Reagan gets caught secretly selling weapons to Iran and using that money to buy guns for the Contras. So Reagan in Nicaragua, there are the communists. The Contras oppose the communists. So Reagan funded these Contras to take down the communists. This does not end up happening, and the government gets caught. So this is the trial, obviously, where top military officials are getting tried. He will eventually bite the bullet, and he will take a resignation from his job. So the fall of the Soviets. So Nikolai Gorbachev is seen as the great reformer to the great sort of destruction of the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev withdraws his nuclear warheads from Europe, and this leads directly to the failure of the Soviet Union to keep its states intact. So the fall of the Eastern Bloc and the fall of the USSR, we slowly start to see the Soviet satellites leave the country and leave the Eastern Bloc. I believe Poland is the first to leave, followed by Czech, Hungary, Tito in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, and then finally with the formations of the Lithuanian countries, with all those countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, Soviet Union's dead. George H.W. Bush is alive. So George H.W. Bush, he wins in a landslide victory. He defeats the progressive liberals, and he literally goes like this on the campaign stage. He says, this is his most infamous part of his presidency. He goes, he goes, watch my lips, no new taxes. That is the campaign he runs on. He does impose taxes, but that was his campaign promise.
Wait, what does he mean by no new tax? He wasn't gonna create.
What do you think he means? Moscow, you can't even laugh because that's a you question. So, the moral majority. So the moral majority will form with this. John Kim, shut up. So the moral majority is a group of Christians, moral people, sort of philosophers, like doing the right thing. So the moral majority, or you might call it silent majority, I guess you could say. They end up electing George Bush to office, and this is followed by the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall will collapse following German emancipation, Berlin emancipation from the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan's speech at the steps of the Berlin Wall, he goes, "Mr. Gorbachev, my one word for you, tear down this wall." And they eventually do tear down the wall. So the Persian Gulf War. So it's Saddam Hussein and Iran is the U.S. is convinced that Iran has nuclear weapons of mass destruction with Saddam Hussein or WMDs. They did not have weapons of mass destruction, and this is followed by Operation Desert Storm. So if you look at my so to do this quickly, you need to shut up. So if you look at my photograph, this is Operation Desert Storm, U.S. troops going to Iran and Iraq to find nuclear weapons. So changing demographics in the country. So growing demographics from Asian and Hispanics. So Asian and Hispanic Americans will outnumber the number of Black Americans in the country individually. So there are more Asians in the country than there are Black people, and there are more Mexican people Hispanic people in the country than there are Black people. So these sort of changing demographics will be the new immigration, if you like to think of it like that. Sure. So political refugees will also come from wars. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina will lead to a lot of political refugees coming from Europe. The war in Iran and Iraq will lead to a lot of Syrian people and people of those ethnicities coming to the United States. So the Clinton presidency. So Clinton is the first president elected to office since Carter. She is in the age of the revolution of technology. It is basically the formation of the internet as we know it today. Clinton is a pioneer of globalism, or the spreading of culture and the spreading of economics to the global spectrum, that we are one globe working together, not individual countries. He will form NAFTA, or the North Atlantic Trade Federation. So Canada, Mexico, and the United States are part of NAFTA. That means we basically have like the free trade. Yeah, sure. So the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal is what he's most known for. So the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal is basically Monica Lewinsky and giving sexual favors to Bill Clinton in the Oval Office. This will lead to a demise of his presidency and to his resignation. So Bill Clinton is impeached, and this will lead to the formation of George W. Bush.
You all know that impeachment means not like that at all.
Yeah, it's just like a process.
Well, you can be kicked out.
If you're convicted, he wasn't. He was. So RGB and Justice Breyer are elected to the Supreme Court under the Clinton presidency. Yes, and so did Breyer, resign recently as well. So the 2000 election. Steve, just a little bit, please. Okay, good. The election of George W. Bush. So George W. Bush is elected. He is the son of H.W. He will be the sort of party platform and the face of neoconservatism. So neoconservatism is the ideology of spreading democracy worldwide and putting corporate interests first. So in order to have the greatest freedom, we need to put corporations first. So this will lead to global imperialism, economic imperialism especially, and the rise of the corporate power in the United States. So corporations will now be able to lobby in the government for a lot of favor, and they can lobby to actually pass laws and enact bills. So African American in politics, we get a lot of African Americans in high-ranking government offices. We get Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Barack Obama, the senator, not the president yet. And we get also the sort of police brutality and the formation of a Black Lives Matter movement. So Rodney King, as seen below, is beaten by LAPD officers with no reason. They just start beating the man with billy clubs. This will lead to the LA riots, in which over I don't want to say billion, I think it's 30 million or something like that. $30 million worth of goods will be either burned or stolen or looted by protesters. And this will lead to a harsher crackdown on the LA police and some police reform, Black Lives Matter movement, such things like that. So also 9/11. So 9/11 occurs and we get the war of terror out of it. So the war in Afghanistan is direct response to 9/11. Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan. The United States goes to Afghanistan, deals with the Al-Qaeda people. They kill bin Laden during the Obama presidency, and we get a power vacuum. So after the invasion of Iraq, we get a power vacuum in the region, which leads to the formation of ISIS as we know it today. So conservative resurgence. We get the rise of the conservative party that we know today. We get evangelicism, so we get the religious conservatives, and we also get the new right. So the new right is also just like the new left. It's the young movement of a lot of students and also a lot of neo-Nazis, a lot of fascists, a lot of people such to that nature flocking to the conservative base. So we get the digital revolution. We get a dot-com bubble. Basically, will or will not the internet be successful? We don't know yet, but the people who invested very early in the internet will make millions of dollars off of the dot-com bubble. So before the internet is actually formally established, a lot of people, such like Apple, Bill Gates, will make a lot of money off of the formation of the internet. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, as well. So modern age, we see the decline of unions. So unions will go on the decline. Reagan mass fires 3,000 air traffic controllers, and he busts a lot of unions. So we lose a lot of the unionization that we gained over the years of the progressive movements, and we have unions today as we know it, where companies can openly union bust with no punishments. Wage stagnation and the repeal of the Banks Act of 1933. So the wages don't go up. So inflation and prices go up. Wages stay level. So I'm paying more with my same wage. So this is going to put me weaker economically, put me into poverty. The Banking Act of 1933. Who remembers what that was? Banking Act of 1933. So the Banking Act of 33 was the federal sort of accompaniment of the banks during FDR. So this was the Moscow.
Gave money to the bank.
No, that's that. I know what you're gonna say. It's not that. So the New Deal will put in place the Banking Act of 1933, which gives the federal government the right to intervene in the banks and the right to control the banks for the best interest of the country. What you're talking about is debt or deposit insurance. It's not that. So gender roles. We see an increased amount of women in the workplace, increased amount of women in politics, abortion rights, protesting, feminism, huhada. Recent trends. Donald Trump, financial crash of 2008, which is caused by numerous factors, mainly the housing market. George Bush makes it way worse than it needs to be. Obama steps in, fixes it after 2 years. We get government bailouts resulting from the financial crash. So we get the government bails out banks instead of bailing out people because they think that will fix the economy, which it may end up doing, may not. We actually don't know because it's still going to play out today. The Affordable Care Act, with the passage under Obama, guaranteeing the right of every American to affordable medical care. Yeah. Obamacare, as it's also called. New populism. We get sort of the new movement of like Donald Trump. Some people call populist because he's appealing to a base that was once neglected. So a lot of his base are called populists. But don't get that confused with the poor farmers. Not the same thing. The election of 2016, where Donald Trump beats out Hillary Rodham Clinton, and there's Russian interference in our elections. 2020, the election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, in which we get the January 6th riots, the January 6th insurrection, as well as a Joe Biden presidency, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. That is the whole course in some of the... So let's put your knowledge to the test. I have a short answer question. So if you have a computer in front of you, which many of you do, or if you have a piece of paper, you might want to write this down. You might want to try it out, and I'll tell you if you're right or wrong. I don't see typing.
Oh, I know about the Iran.
So
well.
So let's do A. Discuss one reason for the elevated public trust in the federal government in the decades prior to the 1970s.
Oh my God, wait. Was there later we discussed where president or something? Civil rights movement.
We get the civil rights movement.
Oh, wait. Oh.
It's good for America. That you have.
Did you write this or is this from something?
This is from my book. I don't know.
Is it?
No, I don't know.
Civil rights movement gave people confidence that the government was willing to change.
I was gonna say decades prior to the 1970s kind of vague. Does that mean like World War II?
It could be.
This goes to World War II. I would have talked about New Deal programs, but that's just me. That's what I would have talked. That's what they mentioned New Deal.
All right, wait.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so.
If you can prove it on a short answer question, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. If you can prove it, like, you'll get the points.
Trust in the federal government would have been when, during the Little Rock Nine, when they took over the National Guard, instead of basically like taking the people out of the schools, they actually helped them. So they basically, the federal government would have played a part in controlling the National Guard to protect the quality of education.
Okay. If you could prove that, I would give you the point.
Like the shorthand for this, if you're trying to remember like a little quick like way of remembering, it's ACE, ACE, answer, cite, and explain. Right? So you have to provide a specific answer, you have to cite specific evidence to demonstrate it, and you have to explain why the evidence you're citing supports the answer you're giving. So like you don't get a lot of room, like it's a little box that you have to write all three of those in. So you have to get in and get out, otherwise you can physically run out of room. They don't want you to write an essay for this stuff.
All right, for number B.
Letter.
I don't care.
B is a letter.
Choose one of the events below and discuss why your choice represents a growing lack of faith in elected officials. So choose one of these. Either let's let the people think about it before we answer. The exit from the Bretton Woods Agreement.
No.
You guys don't know what that is because I didn't even go over it. So let's just move on to the next one. The Pentagon Papers.
No.
What do you mean no?
Well, I don't want to do that one. I said no. It just says choose one.
The Watergate scandal or the Iran hostage crisis.
Easy.
So let's give a second. Let's think about it for a second. Remember, you have to choose it and then discuss why your choice is a representation of the lack of trust in elected officials. So let's go, Steve, Moscow, and
During
Marcus.
the Iran hostage crisis, there was a lack of faith in President Carter because the Iran hostage crisis, the Iran U.S. citizens in the embassy were held hostage for. I'm gonna try to get the exact number, like 143 days, but I mean,
I think it was a lot longer than that.
was it 226?
I thought it was long. I mean, you can Google it.
You can just like.
I just watched Argo a week ago, so like I think it's one of those.
Those
So-
guys are not the hostages.
No, I know, but they like
Are
at
you-
the end when they go with all the facts.
Did you finish?
With Jimmy Carter, lack of faith in Jimmy Carter to free the Iran.
I would also mention nationalism for the
You
country.
mentioned nationalism?
For the
I was
country.
gonna-
Yeah,
okay,
because,
I
like,
was gonna say,
they're
like,
American.
how they
They're
were released
they're
on
American
certified
citizens.
Reagan.
Yeah, they're American citizens. Moscow, what's your point?
I had that.
I would say Watergate, because that's when Nixon, he like bugged the DNC.
How is that representative of distrust?
Because how can we trust a person that's like spying under us anyways?
Sure, Marcus.
444. 444. Hey.
Oh, wait.
It's your turn to go.
Oh, Google says 444 days.
Was it 444?
Well, it's Mr. Kim's version of it.
There's no chance.
All right.
Okay, so I would have explained the Watergate scandal because it demonstrated to the American population that they can't have a leader that they trusted, because once the infiltration of bugging the national democratic, like the other side, like when you bugged it, it showed how like the elections were really truthful and their leader couldn't be trusted.
Sure. For all causes, let's just do. I would pick the Pentagon Papers because the Pentagon Papers literally said that the federal government was lying to the people. Okay, let's move on. So briefly explain why one of the other options is less persuasive than the one you picked. So, Mr. Torres, you would have had to pick an option to do this.
Yeah, but I was gonna pick Pentagon.
The exit.
Okay,
from
so give me why is one of them less persuasive?
I would say the Iron hostage crisis because the federal or the representatives weren't directly lying to the people, instead it was more of a failure to get something done. Compared to directly.
Yeah, I think I would pick the Iran hostage and say something like, even though it might have eroded confidence in the American president, it wasn't as bad as when the American president was a criminal.
That's
You wanted that
true.
to be like, you're
Nappy.
a good guy.
The water.
He's a good guy.
Nappy.
Moscow, which one?
I would pick D because I didn't know what the Pentagon and the exit thing were, and I ran hostage crisis.
Jimmy, what's yours?
I like whatever Torres said.
No, pick your own.
No, I probably actually would have. though.
Okay, explain it one. Explain it then.
Why the Iran hostage one?
Yeah.
Well, as Steve just said, it wasn't like a lie or some huge scandal by the actual government themselves, more like a lack of like control in the situation where they did have a good intent to get these hostages back, but just struggled to do so.
Sure, Marcus.
I have a question, but for when you explain how the Iran hostage crisis was like less persuasive, can you be like at the end of the day, at the end of the 444 days, we eventually got our like what we needed? Like it was like at least like the deal was never like now.
I can read you. This says for C. The U.S. government is not all powerful. Expecting our government to be able to control decisions that our enemies make on their own territory and in secret is unreasonable. From personal experience, most people understand that you can't negotiate from people if they don't want to negotiate with you. So that is the book definition. All right, we're done.
Question.
What?
Is the Watergate scandal with President Nixon and how he was
He bugged the DNC.
And what was A?
So the exit from the Bretton Woods Agreement is the unilateral cancellation of the international convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold. What? What are you talking about?
Can you just quickly say what the answer to part A was?
Oh, I would have done the New Deal.
Nappy, seriously?
And the recording is done.